Welcome to my talk about do you really need Hibernate? I had this talk already at some other conferences, and once I get feedback that my title is a question, and I didn't knew that, but there is Betteridge's Law. It's a journalist from England, and he once said that if the title of a talk or of an article is a question, then the answer is usually no. The point is we are all software developers, so the answer is exactly. So first some words about me. I'm in the software industry for already a very long time. I come from COBOL, SQL back in 1995 and then moved to Java in the year 2000. I'm from Switzerland, maybe you hear that in my accent, and I have my own company for 15 years now. I'm also active at the Java user group in Switzerland. I'm organizing events in Bern, and I have my own company, and also being a teacher at 2 universities in Switzerland, and I mainly do software development in Java. So sometimes I do some architecture, sometimes I do software development, I do coaching, mentoring, depending on my customer. But I also do something else. I do that. So I'm in a sports club in Switzerland already for many, many years since I'm a small boy, and we organize competition for kids. And when I started doing software development, I was looking at these competitions and saw how they are calculating the points and creating ranking lists, and I said, no, that's not possible. So they had like tables, and they did manually calculating the points, creating ranking lists, and so on. And so the first thing that I did for my sports club, I created software to do that. And we reduced the calculation office at the competition from 15 people to 1. So I'm doing that alone. We usually have around 100, 120 kids that come into such a competition. So why do I talk about this software? Because this is a typical example of applications I usually create. So let's have a look at it. It looks like that. So that's the main screen more or less, or the dashboard. And here, for example, you can create ranking lists, right? So ranking list has categories, and in the categories you have the kids, and the kids have results, like here the Franek has 80 meters in 10 seconds and 81. That gives him 622 points. So that's one part of the application. That's pretty interesting because we will talk about how to create this ranking list. But if we look at the remaining parts of the application, you see here I can, for example, filter, or I can edit data. So that's a classical, what I call business applications. Who of you is creating such applications, or kind of such applications? Many of you. So these are all database-centric, and that's also why I have this talk. So I like to show you how you could create that in, like, maybe not a better way, maybe in a different way. So before we go to the demo, let's have first a look at the database model. So this is more or less the same database model that I created in 1997, except one entity, the organization. So my application is now multi-tenant capable, so you could use it for your own events. It's even hosted on a server. You could ask me, and then you can register your own events. And the data model looks like that we have kind of a series. So maybe you know Diamond League or Golden League, or these track and field events where you have multiple competitions that finally gives you a final ranking list. We have the same with one of the competitions that we are doing. And the competition is there where the kids then will do the sports, and we may have a club, we have an athlete that's in a category based on the age, and then we have results. And the event here, that's like 80 meters, long jump, high jump. Whatever, it could be 1 to 10 because we have the decathlon as the kind of category with the most events. Now we will see that in a minute in the demo, but maybe first have a look at the differences between JPA or any other OR mapping framework and jOOQ. So I pronounce it jOOQ. That's because I'm Swiss. There are different pronunciations. You can also use jOOQ, so it's probably the same as with SQL or SQL, depending how you like to use it. And in fact, there is only one difference between doing persistence with JPA and SQL. It's the way how you look at the data or how you look at the objects that you are using to work with the data. So if you look at JPA with Hibernate, for example, what you will do is something that I call entity state transition. That means you load entities or you load data and they will be transformed in objects, and then you work with these objects. So you call maybe business methods, and this will lead to some transformation of the state of the entities. And finally, if you use JPA directly, you just commit the transaction, or if you use Spring Data or something, you call save, and this will be persisted in the database, right? So that's how you would work with data. On the other hand, we have what you would do when you use SQL directly. It's kind of a data set transformation. That means you read data, display the data, someone can edit it, and you send the changes back to the database. This sounds a bit similar, right? But the difference is in the first point, Hibernate, or whatever JPA provider you use, is doing the heavy lifting. And in the second case, you do it by your own. Now this sounds, oh no, I don't want to do everything by my own, right? So this looks like or sounds like a lot of work, but in fact it's not. Let's get back to my application. So what we see here, that's just a result from a query, right? I wouldn't even need object for that, because I could directly display what I'm getting back from the database, more or less, right? And if I go here, I can edit the data. We have here, for example, if it's a boy or a girl, we could have clubs. Here in that case, we don't have any clubs. And finally, what I do if I change that, it updates the data in the database. And for that case, I don't even need nested objects, because the gender and also the club, that's just a foreign key in the database, right? I don't need to load an athlete with a club or with a gender, because I just can use the data that as it is, because here I have like a drop down or a select component to select one or the other in that case, and that's it. That's all I need to do. So you often don't need nested structures, and so this is what I call dataset transformation. So I just read it, change it, and save it back to the database. And for that, there is a framework, because who has used SQL with JDBC, for example, directly? Who liked it? Okay, yeah, that's the problem. So working with SQL is a bit annoying, maybe. It may be better in the future, because we now have this new text blocks with also the kind of the formatting and so on. And maybe this is better now, but it is error prone, right? So JDBC is not nice to work with, but the problem is also you have to deal with strings. And you write the string once, and then you change the database, and then your query fails. So you need to write some tests to check if your SQL statements still work. jOOQ, on the other hand, the idea of that is that it generates Java code from the database. We will see that in a minute. And the other part of jOOQ is a Fluent API that you can use to construct SQL statements. So it looks like SQL in Java. The point is, who is also doing .NET programming with C#, for example? No one. So they have a construct, it's called LINQ, Language Integrated Querying, where you directly write SQL in the code. Maybe I see some older guys here. Did you use maybe embedded SQL, SQL for J, something like that? No, lucky you. So let's go ahead. How can you start? We have an example project. It's on GitHub. CMAS.ch is my GitHub user, and there are jOOQ examples. You can see that. And there's an official documentation for sure, and there is also a huge demo in jOOQ where you see all the features. We will not look at all the features. I want more or less just show you how it works, that you get a first impression how you could use that. The big difference between using JPA and jOOQ is also the approach how you treat the database. jOOQ is database first. So that means you are doing a database model. With JPA, you may create an entity model with classes and let Hibernate create the database. With jOOQ, this doesn't work because jOOQ assumes that the database already is there and you will generate the data from it. So the good point about that approach is jOOQ doesn't care how your database looks like. So if you use Hibernate, sometimes you have to do something either in the database or at most you have to use annotations to convince Hibernate that it should use the database as you designed it before or how it was designed before. Now jOOQ, when we look at the architecture, has two parts. So first we have this jOOQ domain-specific language, which you will see reminds of SQL, where you create the SQL statements. But the more important thing, in my opinion, is the jOOQ generator in the bottom that uses a database and generates Java classes. So if you use JPA Hibernate, for example, you know the meta model API maybe. So that is also something that Hibernate is doing. Hibernate is doing that even more in most recent versions. They are working on other stuff now with data generation or class generation. But jOOQ here generates more or less the meta model from your database. And you can work with that then to construct the SQL statements. Who of you is using store procedures or has to use store procedures? Then you must use jOOQ. Because if you're using jOOQ to generate the Java classes, it will create per package or function or procedures depending on what database you're using. It creates a class. And calling a store procedures with jOOQ feels like calling a regular Java class. So you don't have to do callable statements or something like that. You just can instantiate the class and call the method and you're done. So that's pretty nice if you have that use case. Now I added this slide because in one of my talks I got feedback after my talk that someone said, jOOQ does not scale. However, he had this idea. The point is, it's the other way around, because jOOQ was created by Lukas Eder. Lukas Eder is also from Switzerland, because he was working for one of the Swiss banks, not the one that no longer exists, for some other. And they had huge data models. And in my case, I use jOOQ in an ERP product, so I'm working for a company, so a customer of mine has an ERP product for small, medium businesses, and they have around the 2,000 tables, and because this is a already 35-year-old ERP system, they have like 5,000 stored procedures. That means all the business logic is in the database. And for that use case, jOOQ is perfect, and that's also probably the most important project where I was using jOOQ. Because there, if you want to go ahead and create 2,000 entities and map them to the database, and then you go ahead and try to use callable statements or Hibernate to execute the store procedures, this wouldn't be a nice thing. So maybe we should have a look at the code that you can see also jOOQ in action. So this is my project. Here the jOOQ example. It's a Spring Boot project, by the way. But this doesn't matter. So jOOQ doesn't rely on any framework. So you can, you just need a JDBC connection, that's it. And then you can use jOOQ. But in this case, I use Spring Boot because it has nice integration. By the way, who is using Spring Boot? Who is using Quarkus? Yeah, like always. Now this is already Java 21, and here I use Flyway. So if you deal with the database first, you have to find a way to do migrations. If you use Hibernate, you probably could use the auto DDL generation from Hibernate. They have also an update mechanism. That's pretty nice. But the problem is, if you have database migrations, you not only change the database, you often also have to change the data that is inside the database. So the approach from Hibernate doesn't work in all cases. So I usually use Flyway or Liquibase because these are the two. Who is using database migration? Flyway, Liquibase, more or less all of you. And here in this demo, we will see I will use Flyway to generate the database, because something I didn't say on that slide here is the question is, where does this database come from, right? And this could be different scenarios depending on how you work with your database. So that's all, because I can use here the jOOQ starter. So that means Spring Boot also has integration for jOOQ. If you use Quarkus, you have also integration with jOOQ that you can use right away. And in that case, jOOQ will then take part of, for example, the declarative transaction of Spring Boot or Quarkus, and will use the connection from the connection pool. The interesting part here is the plugin. So jOOQ comes with a Maven plugin. There's also a Gradle plugin to use, but the jOOQ Maven plugin is from jOOQ, and the Gradle plugin is from Etienne Studer. He's working on Gradle, and he created an integration. But soon the Gradle plugin will also be an official part of jOOQ. So who is using Gradle, by the way? Maven? Yeah, like Spring Boot and Quarkus. Exactly the same result. So here we have this plugin, and now I have to generate, configure that. So I need to generate or call the generate goal. And here we have the generator, and you can see in that case we just have a database called DDL database. What does that mean? In my case, because I'm using Flyway, jOOQ is using the SQL statements in the Flyway scripts to create the meta model. Is this a good idea? By the way, this also works with Liquibase. For Liquibase, there's a Liquibase database that even can use for example, the XML migration script from Liquibase. Now, the question is this a real-world scenario? Is this a good idea? The point is, as long as you only have tables, this works perfectly fine. But the problem is, depending on the SQL dialect and on the functionality from the database that you're using, for example, store procedures or functions, this doesn't work. So then you have to have a real database. But I will show you then later on a way how to use that. And finally, the only thing that I do here, I define the package name where I want to have generated the classes. And the code that will be generated goes into target generated sources, and there's a directory jOOQ. Usually this will be recognized by IntelliJ and will be added to the class path, so you can use that. And here we have the metadata from the database. So for example, we have tables. That means we have an atlet table here. And this has many constants. So for example, it has the name of the database table, in fact. And here we have all the columns from the database. So we not only have the names, we also have the type, and we have some information about the type, for example, the length of this varchar, and we have information if it's nullable or not. We have information if it has a default value, for example. In that case, I create default values or the value of a primary key directly from a sequence, for example. And we would even have comments. So if you treat your database as a first-class citizen, you should also comment the database tables and the columns. And that will be added here as well. So as a Java developer, you see what the person that created, for example, the database table has as an ID, so what will go into this field, for example. Usually you don't need all the information here. Usually you just need the constant to create type-safe queries. But if you create some kind of a framework, for example, and need to know more about the database, you can use that data here right away, so that may become very handy. That's one thing that will be created, and the other thing that will be created for each table is a record. A record is not a Java record. A record is a class extending an updatable record, usually, that can be used to write data or to read and write data. It's kind of an active record pattern implementation. That means you have here the information about the table. So you have 8 IDs, all the fields, the gender, we have club ID and so on. And you also have methods derived from the superclass. So for example, we have store. And store will do like save from Spring Data, insert or update, depending on what you're doing with that. So that's what will be generated. And to see that, how this works, we have here a small test. The test, by the way, because it's Spring Boot also has a jOOQ test slice. Like you may use with data JPA test, that means only the database connection will be started and nothing else. And what will be configured and what I inject here is the so-called DSL context. That's comparable with the entity manager or the session from JPA and Hibernate. Yeah. And with that you will work. So we have here, for example, a test where you can find something, and with the DSL you can really write kind of SQL, or it follows the rules of SQL. And here we see a shortcut, because this is the same as select star from competition. I can write that in one line, and we have the result here with fetch is a result. Result is a list that contains records. So that means if you select all the columns from a database table, you get this competition record, and you could, when you get it, you can change it and store it to the database. This will be an update like you would do kind of with an entity. But the difference here is this record doesn't have any dependencies, because if you use JPA, you would map the dependencies. So you would have many-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships. We don't have that here. So we have single records for a table, right? But as you have seen in my application, this is not necessary. So I don't really need nested structures there. Now, if we insert some data here, for example, by the way, Mujinga Kambunji is the fastest woman in Switzerland currently. We see an insert statement. We even have clauses like returning result, so that's insert returning, where we can get the ID back because this is assigned by a default value, for example. But this often is not needed because of this record. So I rarely write insert statements. I write update statements because often I just want to change some columns, not everything. Then I use update, but most of the time I use this record. And so I can create a new record. You see on line 48, DSL new record. The point is, jOOQ needs to know about this record that it can store it. It's the same with the entity manager and the persistence context in JPA, where you call persist if you create something, that it will be managed by Hibernate, for example. Here with this new record, that's the same. And then we can set the information and finally call store, and this will in that case create an insert statement. So that works pretty well. Even the ID is set after that. So if we have default values, jOOQ will return the default values from the database and will fill it into the record. Now that's not very sophisticated, I would say. That's something that works very well. But usually you have something like that. So if you use Hibernate, you tend to read entities. But in my opinion, if you read data just to display, you shouldn't read entities. I know Hibernate has this stateless session where nothing will be managed from whatever you read. If you use like Spring Data, JPA, you have this transaction read-only attribute that also will tell Hibernate not to do anything with the data. But often it's not needed, right? Because what I see often in project is people are reading entities and then use object mapper, model mapper, or some of these mapper frameworks to map the exact same entity model to an DTO model that looks more or less the same. And in my opinion, that's simply useless, right? Because if you have a data-centric application like I have here, then we have like a table. But probably in this table, we don't have all the information, just some of the columns of the database or some attribute of the entity. And on the other hand, here we don't have any clubs. But if we had clubs, we would like to see not the club ID of the foreign key, but we want to see the name. And there, Hibernate would load like maybe a tree or a graph of entities, and this may lead to the n+1 select problem probably, and I don't want to do that. So I can directly select that. But the result is a bit weird, right? So we have a result that's still the list, but now we don't have an athlete record, now we have a record 3. jOOQ has record 1 to record 22. And the records, the good thing about this record is it's type safe. So here we just have strings, that's not very interesting, but the point is I can get then the data from here. For example, if you look at this assertion, and here I can get the value also using the generated data. So here we see that we use the column names from the database, we use the tables, we join here, for example, the club based on the foreign key, and for that we use this generated code. And now if someone is going ahead and changing, for example, the first name to name, my code will no longer compile. And that's one thing that makes it type safe. The other thing that makes it type safe, if suddenly the name is no longer a string but an integer, which doesn't make sense, but it could be, then my code will also not compile because it will no longer return a record string, 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 but it will return a record integer, string, string. So we have this type safety just because we use the model generated from the database, and if we change the database, our code will not compile. So we don't need to write tests just to see if the SQL statement executes. The other benefit of having that is jOOQ is database agnostic. So if you use Hibernate, you could change the database. By the way, who has changed the database in a project? Once? At least once? Twice? 3 times? 4 times? Okay. No, the point is that happens rarely, right? But jOOQ also helps with that. So for example, if you use Oracle database, you can create hierarchical queries with connect by clause. And you could use that, and jOOQ will then emulate the functionality that may not exist in the database that is running underneath. So this may be helpful. But here we have this join, and I don't like this join. And what jOOQ also has, like if you write JPQL queries, and you also have this like navigation from one entity to one relationship, jOOQ can do that as well. So that means, oops, I'm in the wrong line. I'll show you that. So you can do that as well because jOOQ knows that's a foreign key, so it's a to-one relationship. I just create some code like here, the club method, that allows you to navigate without doing the join. So the join will be implicitly done by jOOQ. On the other side, we have the problem with the record 3 because I don't like that. I mean, it's type safe. As you can see here in the test, I use first name, last name, club name. This works, but it's not so nice, right? So it's a bit too much code to just get data out of this record 3. And since we have Java records, we could use them. And that looks very nice in my opinion, because I have something called fetch into, and there I just can say, create me an athlete DTO class out of the result, and jOOQ then looks how he or it can create the classes or the objects. Usually it takes the default constructor, and as it is a record, there's the only way to create a record. So let's have a look at that one. So this is my record here, the DTO, and then this constructor will be called. It also can call setters, for example, or it can use kind of reflection maybe. But you also could use a converter if you have a result that must be converted somehow into this object. But usually you do something like that. Now, if you look at this is flat result, right? But before in the demo, we had a nested result. So we had that one. And the superpower, in my opinion, of jOOQ is reading nested structures. You can't do that with Hibernate, or you can read entities, and you can use entity graphs and fetch join and stuff, and then you probably will get a nested result at the end. But you may get too much data, because it will read a lot of data from the database. You will have duplications of the data. Not so with jOOQ. So let's have a look how I can create this ranking list with a single query. So we have here probably the competition ranking service, and here we see a method called getCompetitionRanking, and in this method we see a function. Its name is multiset. By the way, the people that are standardizing SQL are currently discussing of adding such functionality to standard SQL, so that you can read nested structure also with SQL, because currently it's only possible to return a table, right? Usually the result is a table. How can jOOQ do that? So let's have a look at what I do here. So I have a select for the first level, that's the competition. So there's some configuration of the competition, and then I have the categories, that's the second level. And this goes into a multi-select with subselect, so to say. And then we have multi-set with information from the athlete. And then we finally have a multi-set with the select from the results. The point is, you could do that with SQL already since the 90s. Anybody has an idea how I could do that if I would write it by hand? You could use XML functionality of the database, because with XML you can get back a tree. And recently most of the databases were adding JSON support. Some of this support is quite sophisticated to store JSON in the database, but reading JSON out of the database or getting JSON back as a result already exists for a while, and that's how jOOQ does this. So if we have a look at what's happening when we run that. If I click here on the competition ranking, we see just one statement. So the good thing about jOOQ also is you have a debug level where you can log the statement, and it will also sample like the 5 first results that you see if the result of your query looks appropriate. And the other good thing is it will log the query twice. First, as it's been sent to the database, and then you often have, or jOOQ is safe from SQL injection by default, because jOOQ always uses prepared statements. And prepared statements to debug are a bit hard because you just see question marks. You don't see the real values. But jOOQ here inlines the values. So if we go here to the end of this very, very large statement, we see the ID here is a question mark in the upper hand, and in the lower statement it will be 22. But let's get back to the result. With the result, you see that the first level are regular columns. So that's the data from the competition. But then you see the multiset, and you see here inside there are like kind of JSON array structure that is returned. So jOOQ uses JSON functionality to do that until probably this SQL standard also has support for nested results. And this is one of a really great feature in my opinion, because it uses just, or it returns just the data that you need. So no Cartesian product or something like that, just the data you need. And finally, let's see what we have left in the test. We have also delete, that's the last one, and this looks like you would expect it. This time we call execute, and this will return the deleted rows in that case. If you look at the execution of the queries, we see this fetch in 2. Fetch usually returns a list, but we also have something like fetch stream if you want to have a stream. You could also have fetch 1 or fetch optional, so you have various ways to return data. By the way, jOOQ also supports reactive database connectivity, so R2 DBC, so you will get like a mono or flux depending on what you want to return from the database. And that's how it looks. But something is not really done, in my opinion. It's the problem with the generation of the database model. Because we use the SQL statement, that's maybe fine, but in my opinion, this doesn't work in all cases. One of the good things is that there is a framework called test containers. Who uses test containers? Many of you already. And test containers also saw that the way how you generate the meta model from the database with jOOQ is a bit difficult, because what you would need to do with test containers, you would need to start your database with test containers first. Then you would probably apply the flyway scripts or the Lickybase scripts. Then you generate the data. And the good thing is Siva from Test Containers, he's one of the developer relationship guys. He created a plugin. It's a bit a long plugin. It's called Test Containers jOOQ CodeGen Maven plugin. But it exactly does what I said before. So we can say we have test containers. In my case, I use Postgres. And then we have the generate execution. And here we can configure the database. The first section about the database is for test containers. So we define what type of database we will have. We could define which image it should use, in that case 15.2 of Postgres. And then we have Flyway or Lickybase, depending on what you're using. This is just for demo. I could omit this at all because this is the default location of Flyway. I wouldn't need to add this. And finally, we have the jOOQ generator, because the jOOQ generator can be quite sophisticated. You could also create data access objects, for example, or a POJO model, or bean validation annotation based on the constraints in the database and stuff like that. So there are various options what you can do with the generator. In that case, I just do the same as before, so I can say what's the input, and here we have the Flyway schema history table. I don't want to have that generated. And finally, I do the same as I did in the other project, or in the same project in the other version. I define the package name. And if I run that, then you will see that, for example, I run tests. Then you can see that this starts test containers. So first the management container jOOQ is started, and then it starts Postgres. It generates Flyway, or it executes the Flyway scripts, and then finally jOOQ is running. Here we have the URL that comes from the test container, and here you see the possibilities that we have for the Java generated. So we could even generate JPA stuff, JPA entities out of the database. We could generate validation. We could generate a bunch of other things. And then we have the information what jOOQ finally found. So he found 15 tables. So one is excluded. That's the Flyway schema history. And then we also have sequences that were fetched from that. And finally, the classes and the records are generated, and that's it. And this runs pretty fast in my case. Why? Because I'm using Postgres. Postgres in a test container starts in under a second. So it depends a bit on the machine you have here. We can see how, maybe you see that. Started in 0.9. I even saw that faster. But if you're using SQL Server, for example, then it takes like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, depends. If you use Oracle, then you could grab a coffee because this is a bit slow. And here I had some numbers where it is. Does it scale? This slide here. We have 2,000 tables and views and 5,000 stored procedures. And there jOOQ generates, we also have sequences that is missing. So jOOQ generates around 10,000 classes out of that data model. And that's not a problem, that runs in a few seconds, but have you ever compiled 10,000 classes? This takes 5 minutes around. So often spin up a test container is not what you want to do. Often the question is also, what do you do with the generated code? Because I generate it to the target directory. That means if I run clean, it's away. So I have to regenerate it every time. And with that approach, it probably doesn't work with a large data model. So one thing that you could do, you could run that once and then commit the code, for example. And if you change the database, you have to regenerate it. What we do in that project, we have a separate pipeline that is generating the jOOQ classes whenever the database changes. So they have like a database change process where a pipeline will be triggered, and this pipeline will then update the version of the dependency in our main project, and so we have the newest version, more or less. But you have to take care. If you have like a small project like I have with a handful of database tables, I would say up to a few hundred database tables, this works very well, but if the data model is very big, then it's probably not a good idea to do that during the build time. Now the question, do you really need Hibernate? The point is, you could use it because jOOQ and JPA is not an exclusive OR, because you can mix it as you want or as you like. By the way, jOOQ could even generate a meta model from JPA entities. I don't know why this has been implemented, but it works. But what you could do is you could use jOOQ for the query model. So if you have complex queries, for example, or if you want to use that multiset, if you need a tree as a result, then jOOQ is way better, in my opinion, than Hibernate. It's also easier to use maybe because if you use Hibernate to create queries and you need that fetch join, for example, then you will probably get a lot of queries, because depending on the situation you need to fetch something else. You could use entity graphs, but this leads to a lot of annotations that maybe also not so good. So you could use jOOQ for the query path. If you have functions or stored procedures, you must use jOOQ, because there's no easier way to call them. And if you do bulk updates, you don't need Hibernate at all. There you could also use update and delete statements for sure, but it's not useful in my opinion. But if you have this idea of having entity state transition, that means you load entities, you transform the data in the entity, you call business method, do something with the data, and just want to have a save or a commit and everything should work, then JPA is probably the better way to do that for updating. There is also something else that is quite a nice feature with JPA is cascading. So you could cascade all the methods on the entity manager to the depending parts of your entity model. And we have orphan removal. Everybody knows what orphan removal means. So you have a list of objects, you can remove one, and then this will be deleted because it no longer belongs to the parent, so to say. Yeah. So you can mix that, and that's also a good thing, because often when I get into a project, most of the time Hibernate is used, because Hibernate looks like the default. Everybody just uses Hibernate. No one thinks about that. It's just Hibernate. It comes in even. So if you use Spring Data, JPA, you just have Hibernate and people start using it. And in such projects, you just can use jOOQ as an addition and do the complex querying with jOOQ. You could remove or throw away a lot of the mapping code if you use Object Mapper or Model Mapper just for reading the data. If you want to write data, maybe that's another question how to do that. But for reading, you can remove that and just use multi-set, for example, to create the DTOs. So that's it from my side. Are there any questions? Yes?
Yes, you mentioned that you might not want to run this on a database that has more than 2,000 entities. Is there a way to whitelist specific entities that you want to be converted to classes?
Yes, the question was if you can whitelist some of the tables to get generated. Yes, the generator can do inclusion, exclusion. You could even use kind of a regular expression to define that. So you could say we want just to have that, just this schema, or just these tables with that prefix or something like that. Yeah, you can even define which objects to generate, because if you don't say anything, jOOQ will generate from all objects. So you will have procedures, functions, sequences, types, and so on, or enums, and because there are many, many more database types that usually people use. And for that, you can define what you want to generate. Other questions? Yes?
I think with JPQL, you can use the constructor of your DTO to create your DTO. And it feels like that addresses the querying and nested problem as well. Or would you still prefer jOOQ in that case?
Yeah, the question is, JPA has a constructor expression where you can fully qualify the class name and pass the projection as the constructor parameters. Yes, that works, but this does not allow nesting. That's always a flat result from a constructor expression. And constructor expressions are fine, I use that a lot. But the problem with constructor expression, you could even return an entity in a constructor expression. But you have to be careful, because if you have an entity, this will be managed if you have a transaction, and you could change that. But you think you just read data for reading. That's what I said. If you read data with Hibernate, you should use the stateless session if you don't want to change it, and not the regular entity manager. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
How does jOOQ manage transactionality?
The question is, how does jOOQ manage transactionality? The point is, here we have in my demo, I use the jOOQ test slice. So let's get back to the test. And there you could see that it just takes part of Spring transaction management. So like data JPA test, this jOOQ test class also has the transaction annotation on it. That means that every method will be rollbacked after finishing it. If you use Quarkus or a Java server, for example, you can just have, because if you take that, or if you configure jOOQ, then it will take place of the transaction management of the framework. If you don't like that, jOOQ has also transaction management built in. So you, on the DSL context, you can say transaction, and then you get the transaction context and can do whatever you like to. And jOOQ has a functionality that does not exist in Spring or Java EE. jOOQ can do real nested transactions. Because you could have a transaction with Spring Data, for example, but this is not nested, because it just suspends the outer transaction, runs a new one if you have requires new. But jOOQ can use nested transactions. That means you have save points in the database, and you can just roll back parts of the transaction. Most of the people don't know about this feature, but if you program store procedure, for example, you do that quite often, and this works with jOOQ. Yeah. Other question?
What about the use case that you need to create a table at runtime? Can jOOQ also do this?
The question is, if you create a table at runtime, if jOOQ can do that. No. The point is, or no, it's not really correct. The point is, it will not be helpful. Or you could create like a meta model from a table that exists and switch the underlying table. That you could do. But if you have a table that is not present at compile time, and you may not even know the structure of the temporary table because you do that dynamically based on some query or something like that, then jOOQ will not help because it's too dynamic for that. Yeah. Other question? Yes?
You mentioned in your nested protection example that there is no Cartesian product problem, but it spans multiple tables. Does it collect them using multiple selects, like nested selects? Or maybe I don't get it, but if you have multiple tables and you have multiple joins, then...
Yeah.
Or maybe my question is, how does the query look?
Yeah, that we can have a look at that. So let's take this one here. So the question was, with the multiset, how does the query look like? And the query looks like that. SQL. So that will be the query. So here we have like, that's the competition, and then we have an inner select, or we have a sub-select. And here we're using JSON-B aggregate, that's JSON functionality from Postgres. And then we have a build array functionality also from Postgres. And then we see that we select from a nested derived table, by the way, here at the end. So it will select from table functions. The point is that query here works very well with Postgres, Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, but not with MariaDB. Because MariaDB is not able to do this nested select here from this tables inside over like 2 levels. So this is an open feature request for MariaDB. Yeah. Yes?
How about non-relational databases then? It looks like it's kind of a hack around a relational database.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, what about non-relational databases? The point is that jOOQ only supports SQL databases, but it supports more or less every SQL database that you can have. But the point is, there is like, in my opinion, the NoSQL movement has a bit stuck, or there are some database types, if you look at modern database versions, that are no longer necessary. For example, document-oriented stores are probably no longer necessary if you just use it to store documents. I don't talk about scalability and stuff, right? I just talk about documents. You can use JSON functionality from the database. So you can use Postgres and define a JSON column, and then you store JSON, and Postgres or Oracle will also check if you store valid JSON or not. And Oracle also has support, for example, for graph databases. So you don't need Neo4j just to use graph databases, for example. Yeah, but here we don't, that's not NoSQL functionality, right? That's very old functionality. So directly selecting JSON or XML out of the database exists, at least XML exists for over 25 years. So I think DB2 introduced that or Oracle introduced that in mid of the 90s somehow. Yeah. Other questions? Then I'll let you go into the coffee break, and thanks a lot for coming.